Yeah, I think if you're, Team Giri, that's got to be a good statement
Right.
game as your kind of first debut for online chess with the black pieces against Wesley So, and arguably, pushing a slightly better position with black in a Sicilian. I think that's a very good result for him.
Yep, I agree. And real quick, want to remind everybody, as we've had a pretty significant increase in viewers over the last couple of minutes, people now know the match has started. This is the Speed Chess Championship, match number 3. Hikaru Nakamura and Sergei Karyakin have already moved on to the second round. What you're looking at right here is the matchup between the 8-9 seed on the left side, Wesley So, the reigning U.S. champion and newest, really probably challenger for the world title in the future, 2,800 north of it, and he's just had a phenomenal year against Anish Giri. So this is probably our first really marquee matchup, right, Aman? I mean, we've had Hikaru take on a challenger and Sergey take on a challenger, but this is a coin flip, and we're really excited to be here. So as a lot of you follow our channel for the first time, thank you for being here, and buckle up. It's going to be 3 hours of exciting chess.
Yeah, as you mentioned, it's one of the first times where, we've had a lot of marquee players play Nakamura, Karyakin, but to have two clash against each other is a real treat, especially to see guys who haven't played too much online chess, start to put their foot down.
Well, what do we have here now, Aman? We've got this interesting dynamic of we've got really closed position.
It didn't come from a Nimzo, but it kind of reminds me of those Nimzo positions where white ends up closing the position with c5 and a3, b4. Often you'll find that bishop on f4 inside the pawn chain in a Nimzo. But here we've actually reached it from Queen's Gambit decline, and it's one of those positions that you can look visually and just appreciate white's spatial advantage, but it's very hard for anybody in practice to turn this into a big advantage of any sort. And we often see these positions peter out to a draw, although if anybody has pull in these positions, it is often white, just targeting that c6 pawn in an eventual endgame. But I think the advantage is very minimal at best. But in Blitz, you don't need to have a massive advantage. The only thing is that these guys are reaching the endgame, Danny, and they've got like 4.5 minutes on the clock.
Right. Yeah, and we may see the endgame continue to be reached after, I was going to say, this trade. The rook's going to slide over to a8, and we're going to see another exchange, whether white tries to defend the rook and build up on the exchange or goes aggressively for it. One of the things Aman touched on about the space advantage means that white has further extended pawns in the center. If you look at the pawns, everybody, white's pawns are on average further extended. That tends to give you more options for your pieces behind your furthest advanced pawns. So that's why when we hear this term in chess, a space advantage, what does it mean? It means that the squares available to your pieces behind your furthest advanced pawns. So, but as Aman said, okay, that's great. White has a space advantage. His pawns are better, but black doesn't have any real weaknesses, right? Yes, his position is a little cramped, but there's not a lot going on here. And so that's why you see such a very rigid structure often lead to just an equal position in a draw. But if anybody has an edge, it probably will be white. The A file currently owned by white, and this E5 square kind of begging for a piece to be on it with black's small space disadvantage. So it'll be interesting. So what's the plan here? Does white want to go for a move like knight e5 Aman and make this straight, or maybe a move like knight d2 and try to ask this bishop what his plans are?
Well, it's funny, Danny. You mentioned Reykjavik, where Anish recently performed very well in an open event. I was there as well. In my last round game of the tournament, I played the legendary Alexander Belyavsky, and it was actually the exact same game. But imagine this: black played pawn b5, and the bishop on c4 was actually on b7. So it was an even worse version, and that was the one that I had. And I actually drew it very easily with black. So from my experience, if I can draw that, and based on the analysis that I did during the game and my opponent as well, we couldn't just find a breakthrough. Even if you get the best case scenario, which is all these pawns on dark squares, light square bishop for white, it's a very tough position to crack. Although the way that he's done it here, I do like the fact that the bishop on c4 is almost just misplaced. It's on a good square. You can secure it with b5. Although I don't think Anish or Wesley is going to play that move. But f4, g4, f5 is just kind of a close your eyes, easy plan to make. And I think it's easier to play white here, and that's what matters in Blitz.
Yep, and one of the reasons why f4, g4, f5 is so possible, we saw Wesley do it last game where he opened up his king position despite those all of the stories you hear, don't push pawns around your own king. In a situation where the center is closed, it's not like this queen's going to have easy access to get over here, everybody. And so that gives you the right and the ability to kind of be a little more frivolous, be a little more generous there with your pawn moves and maybe try to create some weaknesses. But Anish, a very patient player. I think Anish knows he probably could have already extended aggressively, but he doesn't need to rush, right? Black's position isn't going to change overnight, and so maybe he can build up for this plan and look at that time advantage. We have kind of the first one of the match. Maybe he feels like if he just sits here, maybe Wesley will kind of get himself in trouble on the clock.
Yeah, that's a good point, Danny. And one thing I always like to do is that when you have the better position and you know that you have all the waiting moves,
right.
Instead of playing G4, it's actually better to play G3. Make your opponent sit there and contemplate what your plan is for 15 seconds, and then next move play G4. Make him think again. So you can actually use these slow pawn moves like H4, H5, F3, G4 to inch up the board slowly. You know you're improving your position, and Black, meanwhile, doesn't have a clear way of activating his pieces. We might see Knight B5. I'm not sure if he's considering that. Wesley, the endgame is definitely worse, but it's probably objectively a draw.
Here he offers the queen trade, everybody, and part of the reason Black can get away with that is because the lone real weakness in Black's pawn structure is this C6 pawn that kind of lacks defense from other pawns. But for White to get at it, you probably need this light squared bishop to head to A4, and if it does, Black probably just puts a bishop on B5 and defends it, or even B7, and after that, where does White go? So, as Amon said, he drew a version of this that was probably even worse for Black already, and we've seen this space advantage for White, kind of like we predicted, not leading to too much. When you only have one target on the board, it's really hard to expect to win. But okay, it's blitz, so we'll see what happens.
That's the question, Danny. Does Queen A6, is this the way that you want to get rid of the pieces? After takes and bishop A4, I guess, as the idea, he's going to play Knight B4, I guess, rather than Knight B8. And it looks like a nice aggressive way to do things. But once White brings the king to E3, I think that we're heading for a draw. But I really think that White has a very decent blitz advantage here.
Yeah, and White's going to be able to poke at both sides of the board, right? He'll focus here and kind of keep Black tied up, then maybe he'll advance these pawns and look for a way through. I'm still going to say I predict a draw here. I don't really know that it's going to be enough. But yeah, if anybody can win, and sometimes the most important thing in chess is not whether you see a win, but the fact that you have the ability to push for a win and your opponent doesn't, right? It's called playing for two results. You can really be patient, work in some of those practical factors like time, and maybe somebody blunders when they don't have a lot of time to think. So we'll see.
Yeah. No, in this endgame, I think that the knight on B4 is extremely optimally placed right now. We can't really be harassed without White, bringing the king over, displacing the knight, everything, and it also watches over C6. But we're also analyzing a position that is probably just going towards a draw. But it's always nicer to be on the White side of this, and it's grueling to play Black in this. If this is going to keep up over the match, you spend more and more of these over the course of an entire match. Eventually, you make a mistake. That's just how it happens.
Right. So what's the deal here now? You said we're analyzing it. Let's do a little bit of analysis. Does White want to trade here? Can White take on C2? And then if the knight takes, obviously now you'd have to worry about the D pawn. Or is White going to save the bishop? Maybe just play bishop E2 and kind of have some potential backdoor ideas of, oh, look at that. A shot I wasn't even looking for. Did Wesley miss this idea, Amon? The idea, everybody, is he's deflecting the knight from the protection of the bishop. And Black can't take two pieces at once. If he takes the bishop, then the knight hangs. So this is sort of a...
You know what it reminds me of, Danny? It's almost like, didn't Wesley have a game against Varakobian in the Pro Chess League, which came down to like a pawn endgame? But there was a trick that happened right before that where it was like the bishop trapping the knight. So imagine that Black plays knight takes A2, bishop takes on C2. If the knight goes back to B4, it's very close to almost getting itself kind of trapped in there if White can take away the A6 square. So that's why he's going to go to C3 and stop also bishop A4. The bishop is on the same, the pawn on C6 and E6 could be targets, but Black can sit pretty firmly with a king on D7 and E7, and I don't think he should have any trouble defending this position.
Yeah, the tough part for White is if White gets too aggressive trying to run his king over here, then this knight on C3, you may find it go into E4 and actually start to have some nasty ideas of his own against White's kingside pawn. So probably Probably, yeah. As you said, this knight is sort of perfectly positioned to both hold against white's threats of bishop a4 and have potential ideas of popping over to the king's side at the critical moment. So so time is now ticking away for both players. We're about to enter the under a minute threshold.
Well, f takes e5 is a draw offer, pretty much. After g5, it seems like. F takes e5, g5, and then black can just sit there. So I think he's got to play d takes e5 if he wants to say that he has anything in this position.
Right, and Amon said this move would have been a draw offer, and that's basically because now we have another set of pawns off the board, and there's just nothing's going to happen over here. There's not enough room, not enough wiggle room to create weaknesses. So Anish takes with the d pawn, everybody, but the risk there is it gave black this passed pawn. Sometimes it's easy to miss a passed pawn when there's what?
I like what he's doing though, Danny. He's pressuring c6 because it makes black think about the move king d7 now in order to free that knight on b4. And the other thing is that you're just coming with the move f5.
Yep, here it comes.
He's done it. Now you really start to think about king c3 and when that starts to work. Right now, I think he's justifying it by knight a6, bishop c6, knight c5. But white is putting a bit of pressure on here.
Yeah, great point. The risk behind this whole line would be if somehow black's passed pawn becomes a big issue, but it looks like with this king so centralized, this pawn is not going to get going to becoming a queen anytime soon. Right. So Anish thinking though, now he's under time pressure, needs to come up with a winning plan before it gets too risky on the clock. So we'll see what he comes up with here.
Yeah, I think it's also important to control the c2 square because, like you mentioned briefly, it's always a bit scary when you start to push those pawns too far. It's kind of hard to visualize all the knight checks and where they're going to end up. Like knight c2 check, knight e1, knight g2, and you never know like what lines are going to get forced out of you. So I think controlling that knight with c2 is kind of important. I think he's looking for some sort of squeeze here, like maybe some triangulation, but the problem is he can't play g5, although that's probably what he's intending soon. And h5 puts a pawn on a light square and doesn't further his cause as far as I can see.
Yeah. Well, they may end up just kind of settling here. They've reached a sticking point. I expect Wesley to just go back to b8 as he does. And the issue for Anish, he's made progress, but now where to go? Black's not going to take here and give white that majority and potential dangerous passed pawns.
Right.
So how does white force black's hand to doing something here? Now he's just going to have to go right back.
That's the thing. He can always give up c6 for c5, and that's why he's able to secure the draw there. If somehow that c pawn was protected, there were like an extra 2 pawns on the board, much better chances, but the way that liquidated, that was going to be a draw.
Yeah, so interesting stuff. We've had 2 draws to start, not due to lack of fighting, but due to just really solid, accurate play, which is kind of the reputation of these two guys, right? I mean, they're both... They're both super solid players, very tough nuts to crack, right? They get reputations, I think, unfairly sometimes for being sort of draw masters because of that, but it's also just, they calculate well enough to know that they can't take certain unnecessary risks, and that's what leads to some equal results.
Yeah, definitely. These guys just are not prone to mistakes, simply, and to have that reputation, even in blitz, is quite impressive. And Wesley, where he does make more mistakes is in blitz if you compare it to his classical chess. But I think that's true for just about any of us, right, Danny?
Right. Well, I mean, certainly true for me. But the time control makes no difference in terms of the amount of mistakes I'm going to make. But yeah. Okay, so here we have, what is this? It started out with a queen's gambit, maybe Nimzo type position. Now we're... headed into kind of a typical dynamic here. White has this slightly better center, everybody, and if he could, he'd like to play moves like e4, and you want to expand on your pawns in the middle of the board. But he has to be careful. Right now, black has a lot of pressure on d4, which is why white played rook to d1. So what's the theory here? I think black plays queen c7 here.
Basically, white is going to have a choice between e4 and c4. So either bishop e2 and a move like c4, trying to play for that structure, which I think is a bit more normal, or you can go to shift your queen over to e2 and try to play e4, because you do sometimes have to get that queen off the c file. So it looks like he's gone with c4, probably planning to play bishop b2 and just get the rooks to the middle of the board. Pretty standard stuff. Black's probably going to put the bishop on b7 and bring a rook to c8 and d8, barring barring something else that he has to calculate. But those would be like the standard ideas. And you always have to be careful as white of some type of knight move from c6, and then a bishop captures your knight on f3, followed by c takes d4, and leaves you with those double isolated pawns. So something to keep in mind.
Yeah, one of the other possible ideas for black in this structure is to consider e5 in some positions. And normally you want to be careful, because if white strikes with d5, that's a protected passed pawn. But the closed position, if black can remaneuver pieces like bringing a knight into d6, the bishop falls back to g7, and sometimes you extend with f5, is sort of kind of an old Indian way to play the position. If this sort of stuff happens, like e4, the knight comes to b7, and in here, white has a space advantage again, but black's knight actually thrives in positions like this where it's closed and can kind of poke at some pawns. So look for e5 to also be a possible idea for black.
And what do you think of the move d5 here?
Oh, yeah,
on the board that's right there. Wesley playing d5, because I think that if you take on b2, queen takes b2, take on d5, pawn takes, that knight would love to go to the e5 square, but it's not possible. And I'm not sure about knight e7. It really looks sketchy with a move like d6 sort of in the position, just lurking there. And obviously queen can come into f6 at some point. So just e4 even in that position is simple enough if d6 doesn't work tactically. But yeah, d5 looks like a nice space game.
It's interesting.
I'm not sure if this is something Anish considered.
Yeah, he may have missed it, and now he has some tough decisions to make. We see Anish kind of going, not necessarily into the think tank, but thinking with his eyes closed. We always like to talk about this kind of exclusive access we have to the player's emotional state of mind. And some players do like to close their eyes when they calculate deep lines, right? They feel like it almost removes the distraction, allows them to just think about the current position. Yeah. So here he, obviously, whatever he came up with there, he decides that he doesn't like that line you talked about, and he plays the knight to e5.
Yeah, and the other thing is, of course, he had to calculate a little bit with the move d6 in this position. That's probably what he spent pretty much all his time on, because d6, of course, black can throw in the move knight takes f3 check. White would take back, and then black has to play the move, I'm expecting, queen to d8. And queen d8 seems like maybe he's holding together, although that pawn on d6 is quite annoying. And if you take the pawn on d6, well, I haven't. These are very light calculations, but leaving that queen on the same line as the rook just feels wrong.
Yep, and I was just showing a line where that bishop can probably just take g6 immediately and get some discovered attacks going. So yeah, this is dangerous. I think Wesley is obviously calculating lines like this. We may see d6, knight f3 check, and then the queen head to that safe square on d8, as you said. So the issue there, if we go back to our analysis view, we have this situation where black's going to have to consider, or white's going to have to consider, did he gain enough with this past d6 pawn to justify the opening of the king, right? Now white's king on g1 is open, and maybe that leads to black getting some kind of counterplay. So looks like Wesley decided against that, deciding he didn't like this kind of position with the king open, and plays a safe move that is designed exactly to prevent the double pawns, protecting the knight, so that if black trades, white can take back with the bishop, and no harm, no foul. So, interesting. I think white still maintains an edge, Ramon, right? I think he's still going to end up with this passed d pawn, even if we get a big trade and another trade. White has the edge heading into the endgame because of this powerful passed pawn here.
Yeah, and it's important that Giri here took on d5 before taking on f3, because I think knight takes f3, bishop f3, then taking on d5, white would recapture with the bishop, and then play something like e4 and really cement that bishop on the d5 square. But he's done it this way. Obviously, we can see the blockade is coming, but so is the move a4, a5. It's going to play potentially e4 if he needs to secure the center. And I think a4 and maybe a5, or just leave the pawn on a4. It restricts the fact that black has a 3-on-1 majority on the queen side, but he can barely move those pieces. So I think this is where white is going to sort of slow down, play maybe like e4, a4, and then start to make these improving moves in the position, which is what he's doing. G3, bishop g2, just slow play.
This is a nice maneuver, everybody, because the bishop stays in a very useful spot as far as supporting that pawn. If he gets f4, now you allow these two pawns to get crazy with it here. And so the space advantage is going to be a tough one for Anish to deal with. We see he's sat back in his chair a little farther than I would like from a camera perspective. I'm going to have to work on that so we can see his face. But I think he's focused here. Anish is very good at saving positions. He's very accurate, even in defense. He finds this move f5, which is a nice way to prevent the plan I just talked about of f4 and e5 coming. Black is trying to force some exchanges. Yes, this is a passed pawn, but at least now white doesn't have that massive duo of pawns crushing through the center. So I like that move f5 by Anish.
Yep, definitely. And the thing about this pawn on d5, Danny, is that, the longer you wait, the more vulnerable it's going to be if we just take all the major pieces off the board right now. An endgame actually could be very bad. In fact, maybe just losing for white. There's two connected pass pawns that are coming at you on the queen side, and that d pawn is probably just bring a king to d6, bishop f7, and look to just take that guy off the board. So in any endgames, I think it's important to realize, and obviously Anish does, and so does Wesley, that black could just be winning or much better. So h4 by Wesley. These are sort of the useful moves I'm talking about. Probably going to think about playing h5. Always a tough blitz move to deal with, throwing Harry the h-pawn down the board. When h5 happens, you never know, or at least I never know, whether you should take this pawn, play g5, leave it there, because the move h6 is very, very tough to deal with, I think, especially with the queen on b2.
Interesting. Now Anish has managed to grab the two passed pawns. Two is better than one. The difference is that maybe white's pawn's a little more dangerous. And I think the other factor we have to highlight here, especially because as time pressure ensues, it will become more of an issue. Black's king is open, right? And so the drawback of f5, even though it eliminated the e-pawn, was it opened up these diagonals. And sometimes in positions like this, it doesn't seem obvious right away because there's no immediate threats. But here we go. And as the position gets more crazy, it's hard to deal with a king that's under fire when you don't have a lot of time on the clock. Certainly, if Anish could get the queens off the board, he would feel better about his king not being in any sort of danger of being checkmated, and that's why he offered that queen trade there. But Wesley wants none of it. He wants to keep the idea of this king being under watch for the rest of the game if he can.
He's played a nice multi-purpose move. Queen c5 controls both of those queenside pawns. It eyes the f8 square, and it covers f2. That might just be the most optimal square for the queen. I'm thinking that some sort of idea of maybe even giving up the b pawn and playing something like c3, if you can get bishop f5 and c2. Like, the further you get that c pawn down the board, it seems like the scarier it is for white to face. And although it's tough for black to deal with his open king, white also has the annoying presence of those two connected pass pawns that you pretty much can't trade queens. You also have to be very careful about even black just sacrificing one of them and running the other one. So there's a lot to think about tactic-wise for actually both players here.
This move g5, everybody, was an interesting one by Giri. What he's trying to do is create almost a bailout opportunity, because what now exists in this position with the open h-file and with this newly open diagonal is a constant possible threat of things like queen c1, king h2, and just a little how's your father here. Check till the cows come home, and he might have a draw. So opening up white's king with this move g5 is really a defensive idea, not so much an aggressive idea, but really trying to create opportunities where black might have a perpetual check option down the road.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, because black's king is already exposed, so the move g5 is not really a big concession. And now we see the move f4, and after queen e1, I'm guessing king h2, and black doesn't have a perpetual. Is he going to put queen e7, or is he going to put that queen?
Super dangerous, right? This move f4 by Wesley really strong because it kind of cuts the communication of that queen and that perpetual idea I just talked about. Suddenly, black has a tough time finding a way to defend the threats on the 7th rank.
What about queen e7? Is it one of queen e7 maybe takes, and then bishop h3 looks very, very close to lights out.
Yeah, it takes, and then bishop h3 taking advantage of the pin here.
He's using a lot of time, Danny. You can tell he's not comfortable in this position, and rightly so. I mean, queen e5 check is in the position. There's a rook coming to a8. He is very close to lost here.
Yeah, he's going to need to swindle his way to a draw with only 20 seconds on the clock. Wesley So still over a minute. Oops, and here we go. A combination that certainly Giri didn't see coming. The queen's coming to f6 check.
Yeah, queen h5 is one of the only moves to, well, you can just trade, and then bishop takes d7. So
yeah, I think it's over. I think we have our first decisive. Game here with Wesley So about to get a victory. Do we have a checkmate threat? Yeah, there we go. Our first
on the board.
Our